This is a conversation with Anne Applebaum, recorded at the Munich Security Conference 2025. Anne is an American-Polish journalist and historian who's been writing on Russia and Eastern Europe for several decades, and whose insights I personally consider extremely interesting and valuable. In the conversation, we talk about the big speech that the US Vice President, J.D. Vance, gave at the Munich conference, and how should Europe respond to the increasingly unpredictable US foreign policies. And we also talk about Russia and Ukraine, the perspective of upcoming negotiations, the possibility of an end of the war, or what would happen after, or whether this will be the final wake-up call that Europe needs, or if we will stay asleep at the wheel, and much, much more. On top of this conversation, I wrote down what I saw and what I'm personally taking away from the conference this year in my newsletter. You can find the link in the description. The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And it's also supported by generous supporters on Patreon, who get access to full-length ad-free episodes and a bunch of other perks. And now, enjoy the conversation. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So for me, this is my first time being in Munich at the security conference. But you've been coming here for quite some time. What are your impressions of this year and takeaways so far? Because it's turning out to be quite interesting. And I think here I have to ask, what did you think of the speech that the US Vice President J.D. Vance gave yesterday that I think, to say the least, was quite surprising to most people in the audience?
You're right to use the word surprising, although not everybody was entirely surprised. What's important about the speech and what's important about this Munich Security Conference, as opposed to previous ones, which I've been to many, is that the Vice President of the United States, who almost always speaks here, whoever that Vice President is, made it very clear that he was not interested in speaking about European security. So that is, without making any other comment about the speech, you had a room full of defense ministers, people who work on military issues, some very technical ones. Yesterday afternoon, I was in a room full of people who were talking about Russian sabotage in the Baltic Sea, which is, as you know, is a big problem. You know, the cutting cables, ships being attacked and so on. So these are people who work very intimately on real problems. And the vice president came. He did not address any of those problems. He barely mentioned them. He didn't even really allude to them. And instead, he made a speech which was much more about U.S. politics and of course, German politics. And that was, I think, a message that people understood, that he is not interested in these security issues. He didn't want to talk about them. He didn't want to address them. And he was telling Europeans that he will not be engaged, and presumably the administration will not be engaged in European security in the way that it has been since the 1940s.
I think that as a European, it can be pretty confusing to try to understand the number of different things that number of different people in the current US administration are saying when it comes to Europe, on Russia, on Ukraine, on European security. You're in quite a unique position when you're both American and European, because you also have a Polish citizenship. What would be your advice for Europeans, and both average Europeans and European policymakers, on how to try to understand what is the current US foreign policy to Europe, and how to basically make sense of all the wave of comments and remarks that are coming our way from the United States?
So rather than trying to make sense of them, although we can go back and do a little bit more of that in a minute, if I were in charge of Europe and I was queen of Europe, what I would do right now is I would create my own very large European defense fund, and I would begin planning for a new era of European security. I mean, whatever else happens, and you're right, there are different kinds of messages from the administration, some more friendly, some less friendly. I think yesterday's speech and the attitude more generally coming from the administration is telling you that you cannot, your only security cannot be the United States. You need to have something else. And so there are actually kicking around some good ideas about creating a European bank for defense, a European fund for defense. There have been in the past ideas about creating more joint expeditionary forces. I have a friend who for years was saying, why don't we create a European Legion, let the French run it, like the French Foreign Legion, and begin to think about European defense in different and more coherent ways. I mean, obviously there are European armies, there are European defense industries, some of which are very good and can easily compete even with the U.S. defense industry, but the scale is not adequate to the moment. And so merely as a deterrent, just to prevent Russia moving further, and as Russia frequently threatens to do, into European territory, it's very important that the EU, not the EU, because it's broader than the EU, that Europe more broadly should begin to have its own plan and its own command structure and its own intelligence and its own satellites.
I couldn't agree more, and I do want to talk about that in Europe more, but just final question on the US. What's your sense of what the US foreign policy on Russia and Ukraine actually is at the moment? Because it is quite tricky to make sense of that.
Well, we'll see. I mean, there are clearly two different schools of thought, and President Trump himself has said different things. He, a few weeks ago, talked about forcing Russia to stop fighting by increasing sanctions and increasing weapons. In the last couple of days, he's talked about doing a deal with Russia, and actually, strangely, took off the table some of the things that we thought might be negotiated in a final contract. I mean, I think the important point right now is to note, first of all, that Russia has not stopped fighting, so we are not close to a ceasefire right now, and second of all, that Russia has not formally or informally given up its goals in Ukraine. So Russia's formal goal is still the destruction of Ukraine as a nation and the removal of Ukraine from the map, in effect, the destruction of Ukrainian sovereignty. And so that means that even a ceasefire, if we could come to one tomorrow, or next week, is a dubious prospect unless it's accompanied by evidence that Russia has given up on that goal, or unless it's accompanied by some kind of European or American or combined security presence in Ukraine that meant that Russia couldn't restart the war in 18 months. I mean, one thing that's very important to understand about how Russia has behaved in Ukraine over the last decade is to note that after Russia invaded in 2014, they occupied Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. They used those territories, they militarized those territories, and they used them as the launching pad for the 2022 attack. And what Ukrainians fear is that if the current border is left where it is right now, that the Russians will use the territory that they've taken in the last 3 years, and that will then be the launching pad for the next attack. And everybody in Ukraine knows this, and this is why the idea of a ceasefire without something else, without Ukraine in NATO, or without Ukraine with a security guarantee, or without Ukraine with some troops, or without some evidence that Russia has given up the idea of conquering Ukraine, or of using hybrid war to undermine Ukraine, which is also a possibility. Without that, I don't see how the Ukrainians can stop fighting. So just stopping doesn't solve the problem. And I know there are people in the U.S. administration who do understand that. Whether that's part of the negotiation right now, I don't know.
Well, you said, I think 4 months ago, that the war will end when the costs that Russia is putting into trying to achieve its goals would be simply too high for it to make sense. It wouldn't be worth the effort anymore. To follow up maybe on what you were saying, do you think we're closer to that now, to Russia giving up? And maybe to add another question on that, what do you think would it take for Russia to change that strategic calculus? Because they've lost, or the casualties are in at least hundreds of thousands. And
well over 700,000.
850, I think.
Depending on how you count. I mean, that's killed and wounded.
Exactly. But it doesn't seem to be that the number of killed Russians is the thing that will change how the Russian leadership thinks about this?
So, I mean, at some point, the number of Russians killed, at some point, the economic damage, at some point, their inability to replace the extraordinary amount of equipment they've lost. I mean, the Ukrainians have this very, very efficient drone system. They monitor the whole front line. They have a system of videoing and marking everything they hit, whether it's just a little machine gun nest or whether it's a huge piece of equipment. And so they know, and I've seen the statistics, they hit hundreds of objects, thousands of objects actually, every month. And so there is a limit to how many people Russia can lose. There's a limit to how much stuff Russia can lose. There's also a limit to how much the Russians can cannibalize their civilian economy in order to pay for the military economy, because that's what's happening now. Their national budget is now, I mean, last figure I saw was 40%, but maybe it's more now, defense spending. And you can sustain that for a time, and it even gives the appearance of lots of economic activity because they're producing weapons, but you can't sustain it indefinitely. And so the theory of victory that the Ukrainians have had for a long time is that at some point the Russians can't do it anymore, and then they realize that, and then they stop fighting. I mean, more or less. What worries me about what's happened in the last few days is that it may be that the U.S. administration has thrown a kind of lifeline to Russia so that they have some prospect of ending the war and of ending it in a way that preserves their ability to pursue the destruction of Ukraine later on. And so I am worried about that.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal, the stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line. And so in every edition, I pick out 3 things that do matter and explain why and what will be their future impact. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. Maybe to get back to Europe and how Europe should approach this and what kind of role should Europe play. I think that a phrase that's synonymous with the Munich Security Conference is a wake-up call. And we've heard of many things that should have been a wake-up call for Europe to try to take initiative and take more responsibility for its security. And I completely agree that we do need to do that, but it does sort of seem that despite the many wake-up calls we've already had, we're still not quite there yet, and we're not actually awake. What do you think it would take for Europe to actually wake up and really take initiative and really start taking it seriously? And will we be ever able to actually get there?
I mean, if you can't do it, then you will lose your sovereignty. I mean, so there will come a point when one way or another, the nations of Europe or Europe as a whole will be forced to confront the fact that either that Ukraine has lost the war and that the war is now moving to different borders, or they'll be forced to confront the fact that the expansion of Russian sabotage and hybrid war is such that Europe is no longer able to function. I mean, there is an ugly, the end games get uglier and uglier, and the longer you put them off. So the price simply goes up. I can't tell you what it will take. If you look at there are many European countries who have already understood what's going on and have responded to the scale of the events. I mean, the very interesting group of countries now is Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and Poland as a kind of Baltic. Maybe you add the UK, although that's slightly exceptional. But this is a group of countries who all understand the threats because they see them every day. As I said in the beginning, there are these kind of visible Baltic Sea threats that happen all the time. And they've all grown their defense spending. Sweden and Finland joined NATO. The Baltics already have, I mean, they're tiny little countries, but they have by proportionally large defense spending. Poland is at 5% of GDP in its defense spending. So that you're beginning to see a coherent grouping of countries. Maybe after the German elections, Germany will join them. We'll see. But you see a coherent grouping of countries who are beginning to talk together. They meet together. They have joint strategizing about what to do, and that's you see them taking realistic activity. I mean, obviously, what we'd like to see is those countries plus the very least, all the larger and wealthier European countries joining. I mean, I don't want to sound like nothing's happening, because I do see in most European countries, I see a change, including in Germany. I see a change in public opinion. I see a change in the politics. I see different activity in the military sphere, in the defense sphere, and different attitude to armies and their significance. Actually, I had a conversation last night with a former German officer who said to me, "You can't imagine what it used to be like to be a German in uniform. People would treat you like a baby killer. You were it was not a nice thing to be." And we laughed, but the difference in Americans get all this respect if they're in uniform and so on. He said it was the opposite in Germany, but he thinks it's changed. That it's not so automatic, that people now understand why some people have to be soldiers, and then the kind of culture of pacifism that was so dominant in Germany for so long is altering. So I think there have been changes. I mean, the question now is just whether they're happening fast enough to accommodate the very, very rapid change in U.S. attitudes.
I do agree. I also see the changes. I just wish they were faster to really respond to the challenges. And I do agree that if we were all like Baltics and Poland, we probably wouldn't need to have this conversation, because European security would be secure. On another topic, since you've been coming here for years, I would imagine that prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, people's understanding of Russia, or perception of Russia, of many Europeans, maybe some Americans, was quite different to how it is now. Do you think that now we do actually understand Russia and Vladimir Putin, or do people still hold illusions or misconceptions about what Vladimir Putin, Russia, wants and how it approaches the world?
That's a tough question. So I've been writing about Putin since he first became president in the year 2000. So that's 25 years. And it's been clear to anybody who watches him carefully, at least since the first decade of this century, it's been clear that it's not just that he's not a Democrat, but that he had imperialist and aggressive designs on his neighbors. It's been clear since at least 2008, when he made a famous 7 or 8, when he made a famous speech here, that he sees as one of his goals the undermining of the liberal world and of the Western alliance. It did take a long time before Europeans, not Germans in particular, because Germany had a special relationship with with Russia because of the gas pipelines. But it did take a long time for Europeans to understand that Russia wished them ill, because the dominant theory of dealing with Russia, and this was true, Americans adopted it too in the initial years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was that through trade and contacts, we would have, if not a democratic Russia, then at least a reasonable, peaceful Russia. And that the best way to ensure that happened was to continue this trade and contact. So it's not entirely, very, very often people are I think, unfair. It wasn't just greed or the desire for money or cheap gas. There was a theory that people believed that by having intimate, complex trade relations with Russia, that we would also have peace with Russia. And I should say, I wrote about this in my recent book, Autocracy, Inc. I should say that there were people believed that because that was the experience of the previous couple of decades. It was true that trade led to peace in Europe after the Second World War. It was true that, interaction with East Germany and with Russia it wasn't the entire explanation, but it was a part of the explanation for why reunification was possible. So people had reason to believe that. And it took a long time for people to understand that that wasn't true. That in fact, by having these economic relationships with Russia, that they were empowering an autocratic state. And then in particular, they were empowering a rapacious oligarchic elite, that a very small number of people were benefiting from this trade, and that they were then using our financial system to steal and launder money from their own country, and that was the system that was being supported. But there were a lot of people who had stakes in it financially, politically, so almost emotionally. The idea that Russia was an enemy was not something people wanted to process. And I should say maybe, and it's very tragic that this happened. I mean, I spent a lot of the 1990s traveling in Russia. I wrote several books about Russia. I worked in Russian archives. I had many Russian friends. I'm not, it wasn't it's sad that this happened. So I'm not cheering people on or glorifying this disaster, but certainly over the past decade, I mean, 2014 was a very, very important turning point, because in 2014, it was clear that Russia not only had imperialist designs on its neighbors, but also that Russia wanted to show the Europe and the transatlantic community and the democratic world that it no longer cared about our laws, our rules, rules about not changing borders by force. They were going to, invade Crimea, and they were going to take Crimea, and they were going to change the border, and they didn't care about our institutions. And I believe that in 2022, they attempted to repeat that. And then in 2022, they wanted to also show we don't care about human rights. We don't care about the Geneva Convention. We don't care about the UN Charter. We want to show that might makes right, and we can destroy another country if we want to. And that was a message of, it wasn't just imperial aggression. It was also, it was a strike in the war of ideas. Their idea is that the world should be ruled by large, brutal powers who get to do what they want, and other countries, little countries, don't count. And I think maybe people are beginning to understand that now. But it's true that the people had so much hope and so much money and there was so much at stake in the original vision and the desire for that to be true, that it took a long time to let it go.
Let me take a quick break here from the conversation to tell you about my Patreon. I do these interviews in my free time because I enjoy them, but if you want to help me make more of them, consider becoming a supporter. In return, you will be able to ask my future guests your questions, get Patreon-only episodes and bonus content, and watch all the interviews couple days early and without ads. You can go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics or use the link in the description to check it out. But whatever you do, thank you for watching. And now, back to the conversation. Yeah, that's really well put. I think I want to be cautious of our time, but I wanted to touch on the potential negotiations a little bit more, because you've already mentioned that the approach should be from a position of strength rather than from a position of weakness for it to make work. But another aspect is that negotiations with Russia, the difficulty is that Russia is not exactly famous for keeping to deals and promises. And I'm from the Czech Republic. I think many Eastern Europeans have in their historical memory that any deals might not last very long. How do you approach negotiations with an actor that has a history of acting like that?
I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, that was one of the reasons why I'm a little skeptical of negotiations. The only way to do it would be to have some, as I said, some form of security guarantee, some form of hard power that is prepared to ensure whatever it is that is negotiated. And I just caution everybody. Yeah, there was been a kind of phenomenon, especially in Washington over the last few months, of it's almost kind of people who work for think tanks talking to themselves. I mean, there's been we're going to have this end of the war, that end of the war, and here's what the ceasefire is going to look like, and that, and none of it is based in any visible reality yet. So the Russians have not stopped fighting. They have not made any gestures. They have not made any gestures towards the sovereignty of Ukraine. On the contrary, they talk about President Zelensky of Ukraine being illegitimate. So we're not right now as we're speaking. I mean, maybe something will change in the next 24 hours. Right now, as we're speaking, there is no indication that we're even close to some kind of solution that would preserve Ukrainian sovereignty. So just everybody should be very cautious. There would have to be a real visible change in Russia's goals. And there would have to be some kind of hard power moment when we intervene. I should also say, repeat really, there could be a very dangerous moment. And the moment would be if there were a ceasefire, but there were not some permanent security arrangement, then it will be a very dangerous moment for Ukraine. And there is a possibility of unrest. Maybe people would leave the country. A Ukraine that is theoretically at peace, but not inside a security architecture, not any guarantees, nothing. Nobody will invest there. People will be afraid to live there. If people simply assume that the next wave of invasion is coming next year or the year after, and then we have, an enormous possibility of stability. So I want Europeans in particular to focus on the dangers of that moment. So we're not just getting to a ceasefire, just getting to a moment when people stop shooting maybe it's not even half the battle. And stipulate we're not even close to that yet. But if we got to that, but we didn't have an end game, that could be very dangerous.
My final question, and I think we're running short on time, so feel free to be very brief. But I think another risk is that if there is a ceasefire, there will be a push from some corners for a new normal, or for rather a return to how things were before the Ukraine invasion, for the gas to start flowing again, trade relations being reinstated, maybe sanctions lifted. I think that's a very bad idea. But what should a new normal look like? Because Russia is probably not going anywhere, and it's likely to be a threat for a long time in the future. So what should be the new modus operandi of Europe when you do have this major threat on your
we need, before we can lift sanctions, I wouldn't even say return to normal, because we'd have to reinvent our relationship with Russia. There's no normal to go back to. But we would need some evidence of political change in Russia. And I don't mean regime change. I mean, the Russians would have to give up the idea that they have a right to invade Ukraine and that they have a right to invade other neighbors, because they talk all the time about invading people. It's a part of they do it on TV, and it's they want to invade Poland, they want to invade Germany, they want to invade, the United States, they want to nuke UK. They say this all the time, but we would need some evidence that they have given that up and that they want to be a normal European country. So normal European country is a country that keeps to its own borders, worries about its own prosperity, trades according to contracts and within a legal system with other European countries. That's the kind of Russia we could live with, whatever its political nature is or character. And we need evidence that they have become that. And I don't know what that evidence would be. I can't tell you, but we would know it when we saw it. We would need evidence that they are no longer aggressive, that their goal is no longer to undermine us, that they have ceased their sabotage operations, that they aren't running, propaganda campaigns inside our countries, that they aren't doing, political warfare, which they do constantly, including right now in Germany and in your country as well. We would need evidence that had stopped. And then we can have a relationship with Russia as if it were, a European neighbor.
Well, thank you so much. I could have this conversation for a lot longer, but the time is limited. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.